Exploitation films are a strange and fascinating corner of cinema. They are movies that take one idea, often dark, shocking, or taboo, and push it to its absolute limits. These films don't shy away from blood, violence, or controversial themes. Instead, they use them as their selling points. During the 1970s, these kinds of movies became incredibly popular. They drew crowds who were curious, or maybe even a little scared, to see what filmmakers could get away with on screen. Different subgenres of exploitation films emerged, each more intense than the last. There were splatter films, famous for their over-the-top gore, cannibal movies, which dared to explore themes too gruesome for most, and of course, slasher films, stories about ruthless killers chasing their victims. Some of these movies are still remembered as cult classics, while others faded into obscurity. But what makes these films even more interesting is how they blurred the line between art and shock value. Some movies, like Night of the Living Dead, are now considered groundbreaking. Others are remembered more for their controversy than their quality. Still, there's no denying their impact on cinema. And within this world of exploitation films lies a story so eerie, so unsettling, that it's impossible to forget. This is the story of Campground Slaughter. Exploitation films thrived by taking risks that mainstream movies avoided. They were bold, unapologetic, and often crossed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable. These films didn't just entertain, they shocked, provoked, and sometimes disturbed their audiences. Whether it was extreme violence, graphic imagery, or taboo subjects, exploitation films turned controversy into their greatest weapon. What set these movies apart wasn't just their content, it was their audacity. They tackled subjects like revenge, survival, and the darkest parts of human nature, often on shoestring budgets. Some were poorly acted and cheaply made, while others showed flashes of genius hidden beneath their grime. But no matter their quality, these films had a raw energy that couldn't be ignored. The genre created its own rules. Entire subgenres sprang up, each more outrageous than the last. Revenge films, for instance, often portrayed characters pushed to the brink, fighting back in ways that were both cathartic and horrifying. Women, unfortunately, were often central to these stories, used as symbols of vulnerability or vengeance, depending on the narrative. This duality made these films controversial, sparking debates about their intent and impact. And while many of these films faded into obscurity, their influence lingers. The slasher genre, now a staple of horror, owes much of its identity to the groundwork laid by exploitation films. Yet, for every film that became a classic, countless others disappeared into dusty bargain bins or were forgotten entirely. One of those forgotten films, however, left behind more than just a shadow. It left behind a legend, and that legend is Campground Slaughter. In the murky depths of forgotten cinema lies a film that few remember but many whisper about. Campground Slaughter. Released in 1975, it was a low-budget horror movie that followed the familiar slasher formula: a group of teenagers, an isolated setting, and a killer lurking in the shadows. On the surface, it seemed like just another attempt to cash in on the growing appetite for violent thrillers. But Campground Slaughter stood apart, not for its quality, but for the unsettling stories that surrounded its production and release. The movie's plot was simple yet effective. A group of friends goes camping near the site of an old murder spree. Decades earlier, a serial killer had terrorized the area, leaving behind tales of bloodshed and warnings to stay away. Predictably, the teens ignore the ominous history and become targets of a new killer. What shocked audiences at the time wasn't the story itself, but the film's ending. Unlike most horror films of the era, where the heroine triumphs, Campground Slaughter concluded with the brutal death of its protagonist, Maria. It was unexpected, grim, and haunting, a decision that left viewers unsettled and critics baffled. What makes Campground Slaughter even more intriguing is what happened off-screen. Tales of its cursed production and mysterious aftermath are more chilling than anything the film depicted. It wasn't just a movie, it became a legend, one that raised questions about how far filmmakers would go to blur the line between fiction and reality. Little did anyone know, the chaos behind the scenes would overshadow the film itself, turning it into a ghost of cinema's past. Recorder Films wasn't always a name associated with horror and controversy. In fact, its origins were far from sinister. Founded in the 1940s, the company initially worked on government-commissioned projects. These included war propaganda and anti-drug films, simple productions meant to influence public opinion during turbulent times. It was a modest but steady start for the studio, run by Alan Rickwalder's father. As the years passed, Recorder Films adapted to the changing tastes of audiences. In the 1950s, they dabbled in science fiction, riding the wave of Cold War paranoia that inspired tales of alien invasions and atomic-age monsters. By the 1960s, the company returned to its roots, producing more anti-drug films to capitalize on the growing counterculture movement. Despite its adaptability, the studio was never seen as a powerhouse of creativity. It churned out content quickly, often prioritizing quantity over quality. When Alan Rickwalder took over in the early 1970s, he had a different vision. He saw the rise of exploitation films as an opportunity to make a mark in a rapidly growing genre. While his family's work had been safe and conventional, Alan wanted to take risks. He was fascinated by the darker side of storytelling and had a particular obsession with supernatural horror. Yet, his ambitions were always limited by tight budgets and a lack of resources. This hunger for innovation and notoriety would define Recorder Films during Alan's leadership. Campground Slaughter was his chance to push boundaries and create something that would be remembered, though perhaps not in the way he intended. What began as a typical low-budget horror movie soon became a nightmare, not just on screen, but for everyone involved. Alan Rickwalder was not your typical filmmaker. He didn't just want to create movies, he wanted to create fear. His fascination with horror wasn't a passing interest, it was an obsession that seemed to consume him. While others in the industry focused on shock and gore to sell tickets, Alan believed in something deeper. He wanted his films to unsettle viewers, to haunt them long after the credits rolled. To him, horror wasn't just a genre, it was an art form. Though he lacked the resources to bring his grand ideas to life, Alan was relentless in his pursuit of creating the ultimate horror experience. He often spoke about the power of the unknown, the way subtle, creeping dread could be more terrifying than outright violence. His dream was to blend supernatural elements with psychological tension, creating films that lingered in the minds of audiences. But his vision was constantly held back by his limited budget and his studio's reputation for cheap, fast productions. Despite these constraints, Alan's passion drove him to take risks others wouldn't. He would rewrite scripts, push actors to their limits, and make creative sacrifices just to capture the smallest detail of his vision. To his colleagues, this intensity was both inspiring and unnerving. Some admired his dedication, while others saw it as a sign of something darker, a man who was losing himself in his work. By the time Campground Slaughter entered production, Alan's obsession had reached new heights. He was determined to make the film that would finally showcase his talent and redefine horror. But as his passion turned to fixation, it began to affect not only his work, but the people around him. What started as a dream to create real fear would spiral into a nightmare no one could escape. The pre-production phase of Campground Slaughter was chaotic from the start. Alan Rickwalder's determination to make a groundbreaking horror film collided with the harsh reality of his limited resources. The script, penned by Joseph Esther, was rewritten multiple times at Alan's insistence. He demanded more violence, more shock, and more scenes designed to push boundaries. Each revision added layers of intensity, but it also stretched the production's already tight budget to its breaking point. Casting was no easier. Without the funds to hire experienced actors, Alan turned to local college students, offering them little more than pocket money and the promise of exposure. The lead role of Maria was given to a shy ichthyology major, convinced by her friends to audition. Many extras were unpaid, brought in from the nearby University of Akron simply to fill scenes. The cast's inexperience would later show in their performances, but Alan seemed unconcerned. To him, their rawness added authenticity. The film's locations were another challenge. Rather than paying for professional sets, Alan repurposed a rundown car park scheduled for demolition. He transformed the space into a makeshift soundstage, constructing flimsy sets meant to resemble high schools, shops, and other key locations. It was a cost-saving move, but one that came with constant technical issues. Equipment frequently malfunctioned, and the sets were barely held together. Crew members joked that the real horror was the risk of everything collapsing mid-shoot. Yet despite these obstacles, Alan remained focused. His drive to create something unforgettable overshadowed the growing frustrations of the cast and crew. Little did they know, the challenges they faced during pre-production were only the beginning. As filming began, the already tense atmosphere would take a much darker turn. As production of Campground Slaughter got underway, the atmosphere on set grew increasingly tense. What began as minor inconveniences quickly escalated into a string of unexplained and unsettling events. Alan Rickwalder's behavior was at the center of it all. Known for being driven, he now seemed consumed by the film, abandoning the jovial personality his colleagues once knew. He became distant, temperamental, and obsessed with controlling every detail of the shoot. The cast and crew bore the brunt of Alan's escalating demands. He pushed them to their limits, insisting on long hours and retakes until exhaustion set in. Arguments became a daily occurrence, with Alan often clashing with actors over their performances. One particularly heated dispute led to the abrupt departure of Jack Manderley, a key supporting actor, who walked off the set after hours of berating from the director. Rather than addressing the situation, Alan rewrote the script to cut the character entirely, further complicating the already chaotic production. Adding to the tension were a series of bizarre technical failures. Cameras malfunctioned inexplicably, lighting equipment flickered without cause, and tools seemed to disappear only to reappear in strange places. Crew members began whispering about the symbols that started appearing around the set. I like designs with surrounding circles, hastily scrawled on props or hidden in corners. Those who noticed them often reported sudden headaches, dizziness, or an overwhelming sense of unease. Even Alan's demeanor seemed to darken further as these strange incidents continued. He rarely spoke to anyone outside of giving orders, spending long hours locked away with his notes. One janitor claimed to have glimpsed those notes and described them as ramblings filled with nonsensical phrases and repeated sketches of the same eye-like symbol. When the janitor mentioned this to others, Alan fired him the very next day, citing a completely unrelated excuse. By this point, the set felt more like a pressure cooker than a workplace. Crew members began leaving one by one, citing stress, fear, or simply unwillingness to endure Alan's erratic behavior. For those who stayed, however, the worst was yet to come. As filming moved to outdoor scenes, the production's strained environment would become something far more sinister. The strange events on the set of Campground Slaughter didn't stop at technical malfunctions and Alan Rickwalder's erratic behavior. As filming progressed, crew members began reporting encounters that defied explanation. At first, these incidents were subtle, barely noticeable flashes of movement in the corners of their vision, an odd chill in the air, or the unshakable feeling of being watched. But as the production continued, the occurrences became harder to ignore. One actor described seeing shadows darting between the trees during a night shoot, though no one else on set saw anything. Another crew member, tasked with handling equipment, claimed that his tools were covered in a sticky black substance when he returned to them after a short break. No one could explain where it had come from. Rumors began to spread that something or someone was stalking the set, but no evidence was ever found. The symbols that had been appearing since the early days of production became a growing source of fear. At first, they seemed like simple doodles left behind by someone in the crew. But the more people saw them, the more unsettling they became. One actor claimed that after accidentally touching a symbol etched onto a prop, he was plagued by blinding migraines and vivid nightmares. Others who came into contact with the symbols reported similar symptoms: exhaustion, nausea, and a heavy sense of dread that lingered for days. Despite the growing unease, Alan dismissed these complaints as paranoia and urged everyone to focus on the film. But even he wasn't immune to the unsettling atmosphere. Crew members noticed that Alan's obsession with the project grew more intense, as though he was trying to block out the strange events by immersing himself in his work. He spent hours alone in the editing room, and when he did emerge, his eyes were sunken, and his demeanor was colder than ever. As the tension on set reached a breaking point, the unexplained incidents only grew more frequent. Objects would move on their own. Whispered voices seemed to come from nowhere. And always, those symbols, the ever-present, eye-like marks, seemed to follow the crew, appearing in the most unexpected places. By this point, it was clear to many that something far beyond the normal stresses of filmmaking was at play. But with so much at stake, leaving the project wasn't an option for most. What they didn't realize was that the worst was still to come. The editing room of Campground Slaughter became a place of growing mystery and dread. Alan Rickwalder spent countless hours locked inside, working on the film with an intensity that unsettled even those who were used to his obsessive nature. Crew members often spoke in hushed tones about the eerie silence that surrounded the room, broken only by the occasional sound of film reels whirring or Alan muttering to himself. No one knew exactly what he was doing in there, but his behavior suggested it was far more than just piecing the movie together. Joseph Esther, the film's scriptwriter, was one of the few who dared to approach the room. Late one night, while Alan was away, Joseph decided to sneak inside, his curiosity overpowering his fear. What he found left him shaken. The editing room was in complete disarray. Papers and film reels were scattered everywhere, as though Alan had been working in a frenzy. The walls were covered with sketches of the now familiar eye-like symbol, some drawn so forcefully they had torn through the paper. On the desk, Joseph found a stack of notes scribbled in Alan's handwriting. The words were barely legible, a chaotic mix of fragmented thoughts and strange phrases that made no sense. "She's watching," one note read. "Keep her in the frame," said another. It was clear that Alan's obsession had spiraled into something darker, something even he might not have fully understood. In the corner of the room, a projector stood aimed at a blank wall. Unable to resist, Joseph turned it on and watched as footage from the film flickered to life. At first, everything seemed normal, but as the scenes played out, Joseph began to notice subtle, disturbing details. A shadowy figure appeared in the background of several shots, just barely visible but undeniably present. It wasn't any of the actors, and it wasn't in the script. As the footage continued, Joseph's unease deepened. The shadow grew more prominent, and the same symbol that haunted the set began flashing on the screen, hidden in quick, almost imperceptible cuts. The longer he watched, the heavier the room seemed to feel, as though the air itself had thickened. And then, just as the final scene played out, Joseph felt a light touch on his shoulder. He spun around, but no one was there. Shaken, Joseph fled the room and never returned. He left the production entirely shortly after, claiming he had found work elsewhere. His experience was never officially documented, but whispered accounts of his story spread among those who remained. For the crew, the editing room was no longer just a workspace. It was a place where the boundaries between reality and something far darker seemed to blur. And as Alan continued his solitary work there, it became increasingly clear that the project was consuming him in ways no one could have foreseen. The production of Campground Slaughter reached its breaking point during the filming of the final scene, a sequence meant to be the climax of the entire movie. Tensions were already high, and the atmosphere on set had grown unbearable. Crew members worked in silence, avoiding eye contact, as if the weight of everything that had happened before hung heavily over them. Alan Recorder, however, seemed more determined than ever, pushing everyone to their limits to capture what he called the perfect ending. The final scene required Maria, the protagonist, to face the killer in a harrowing confrontation. The script called for a struggle in a dense forest, culminating in Maria's tragic death. The sequence was meant to be shocking, intense, and unforgettable. But Alan's approach to filming it went beyond the usual demands of a director. He insisted on complete authenticity, putting the actors through extreme physical and emotional stress. For the actress playing Maria, this meant repeatedly performing dangerous stunts, including dangling precariously over a ravine for one shot. She protested, but Alan threatened to replace her, leaving her with little choice but to comply. The mood on set darkened further when reports surfaced that someone or something had tampered with the equipment the night before. Cameras were found coated in a sticky, tar-like substance, and several lights refused to function despite being in perfect working order the day before. Alan dismissed these incidents, but the crew couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The day of the shoot, everything came to a head. As the actors performed the climactic fight, the tension on set became almost unbearable. Then, without warning, disaster struck. A large lighting fixture, secured high above the set, suddenly broke loose and came crashing down. The actor playing the killer was struck directly, sustaining fatal injuries. The actress portraying Maria was also hit, suffering multiple fractures and severe burns. Crew members scrambled to help, but the scene was utter chaos. Even more disturbing were the injuries themselves. Doctors later noted that the burns on the actress's body were unlike anything they had seen before. The marks resembled human handprints, as if someone or something had deliberately pressed against her skin with immense force. Though she initially survived the accident, complications during surgery claimed her life a few days later. The death of the killer's actor added to the growing sense that this film was cursed. Alan, shaken but still consumed by his obsession, refused to let the tragedy halt production. He quickly announced plans to. The screening of Campground Slaughter was meant to be the culmination of all the chaos and effort poured into its creation. Alan Recorder had edited the film alone, working tirelessly in his basement for weeks after production wrapped. By the time the final cut was ready, most of the cast and crew had distanced themselves from the project, leaving Alan to arrange a single showing at a small, obscure theater. The event was barely advertised, drawing only a handful of curious locals and film enthusiasts. From the moment the film began, the audience sensed something was off. The movie started innocently enough, with the teens discussing their camping plans and joking around in their small-town high school. But as the plot progressed, the discomfort in the room became palpable. Subtle details that weren't in the script started to surface, shadows moving in the backgrounds of scenes, faint whispers barely audible over the dialogue, and fleeting flashes of the now infamous "I like" symbol. The violence, already intense in the original script, was far more graphic on screen. Deaths that were written as quick and relatively tame were transformed into grotesque, drawn-out scenes of unimaginable brutality. One character, meant to be strangled in the script, was instead shown being dismembered in horrifying detail. Another was eaten alive by an unseen force, her screams lingering far longer than anyone in the audience could bear. The realism of these moments left viewers unnerved, with some glancing over their shoulders as though they expected to see something lurking in the shadows of the theater. Then there was the final scene. Though Alan had claimed to have cut it after the on-set tragedy, it remained in the film, albeit in a form no one recognized. Maria's desperate flight through the woods was haunting, not because of the killer's pursuit, but because of her unrelenting terror. She stumbled into a clearing that wasn't part of the original set, collapsing as if she truly had nowhere left to run. Turning to face the camera, she sobbed and begged for help, not in character, but as though she was speaking directly to the audience. What followed was even stranger. The killer emerged, not as the actor who had portrayed the role, but as something entirely different. The figure was taller, its body covered in what looked like decayed skin oozing black tar. Its face was obscured by a tangled mess of hair, but its eyes burned with a strange, unearthly intensity. The figure stared directly into the camera for what felt like an eternity, its presence suffocating the room. Then, with a sudden, jarring motion, it lunged at Maria, stabbing her in grotesque detail before the screen went black. The audience sat in stunned silence as the credits rolled. Many left before they even finished, pale and visibly shaken. Some muttered about feeling cold hands touch their shoulders during the film, while others complained of splitting headaches that only began during the screening. Alan, disheveled and hollow-eyed, stood in the back of the theater, watching the reactions with a strange, unreadable expression. When the lights came on, he was nowhere to be found. The theater, citing complaints from attendees, refused to show the film again. Reviews, sparse as they were, called it disturbing in ways that went beyond normal horror. For most who saw it, Campground Slaughter wasn't just a film, it was an experience they wished they could forget. But for Alan, the nightmare was far from over. What happened at the screening was only the beginning of the film's dark legacy. After the disastrous screening of Campground Slaughter, Alan Recorder disappeared from public view, retreating into his small suburban home. Those who knew him said he was no longer the same man. Once a driven, if eccentric, filmmaker, he now seemed hollow and consumed by something far beyond his work. Neighbors occasionally saw him in his yard, disheveled and mumbling to himself, his eyes bloodshot as if he hadn't slept in days. Inside his home, Alan's obsession with the film grew to disturbing levels. He spent nearly all his time in the basement, which he had converted into a crude editing studio. His wife would later describe the space as suffocating piles of film reels, torn papers, and unfinished drawings scattered across every surface. The walls were covered in sketches of the same eye-like symbol that had plagued the production, drawn again and again in a maddening repetition. Alan's behavior became increasingly erratic. He spoke less to his family and withdrew from his children entirely. When his wife confronted him, he brushed her off, insisting that he was close to finishing something important. His obsession created a rift in their marriage, and eventually, His wife packed her things and left, taking the children with her. Alan didn't try to stop them, or he barely seemed to notice. Left alone, he spiraled deeper into his fixation. He was often heard pacing the basement late into the night, speaking to himself, or, as some speculated, to something unseen. Delivery workers reported strange encounters when they dropped off packages. Alan would answer the door looking disoriented, his clothes filthy and his hands covered in smudges of black ink or tar-like residue. He would snatch the packages without a word and retreat back inside. The few visitors who ventured into his home described it as suffused with a heavy, oppressive air. The walls were streaked with strange stains, and the house smelled faintly of decay. Most disturbing of all, Alan began to claim that the film wasn't finished. Despite its release, he insisted there was something missing, something he had to capture before it could truly be complete. Weeks turned into months, and Alan's isolation deepened. The once amiable director now lived in near total darkness, surrounded by his unfinished work and haunted by whatever had taken hold of his mind. To those who had worked with him, his descent into madness seemed almost inevitable, a grim reflection of the cursed project he had poured his life into. Little did anyone know, his story would end in a way even darker than the film itself. Among the sparse accounts of Campground Slaughter's lone screening, none are more haunting than the testimony of Justine Caldwell, one of the few attendees who came forward to share her experience. A local film enthusiast, Caldwell attended the showing out of curiosity, unaware of the sinister reputation that had begun to surround the project. What she witnessed that night stayed with her for the rest of her life. According to Caldwell, the atmosphere in the theater was tense from the moment the lights dimmed. As the film began, there was an almost tangible unease among the audience. She recalled feeling an oppressive weight in the air, like a storm brewing just out of reach. While the opening scenes were unremarkable, things quickly took a darker turn. Shadows that shouldn't have been there moved across the screen, and objects in the background seemed to shift position between cuts. Caldwell initially dismissed these details as editing mistakes, but they left her unsettled nonetheless. The violence, she said, was unlike anything she had seen before, not just for its graphic nature, but for its intensity. Each death felt more real than the last, as though the actors weren't performing but genuinely suffering. The sounds of their screams were piercing, and she swore she could hear faint whispers beneath the soundtrack, speaking words she couldn't understand. Several people in the audience began shifting uncomfortably in their seats, and a few even left midway through the film. Caldwell's account of the final scene was especially chilling. She described Maria's plea for help as disturbingly genuine, her eyes locked directly on the audience as though she was truly begging for her life. But what struck Caldwell most was the killer. Unlike the actor originally cast in the role, the figure that appeared on screen was something entirely different. Naked, decayed, and oozing black slime, the killer's movements were unnatural, almost jerky, as if it were being controlled by an unseen force. Its face, obscured by tangled black hair, revealed glimpses of what Caldwell described as a nightmare made flesh. When the screen went black, the silence in the theater was deafening. Caldwell said she stayed seated, frozen, as others hurried out. It wasn't until the lights came back on that she realized her hands were shaking. As she got up to leave, she glanced back at the projection booth and thought she saw Alan Recorder standing there, watching the empty theater with hollow eyes. By the time she reached the exit, he had vanished. Caldwell would later admit that she couldn't remember parts of the film, as if certain scenes had been erased from her memory. She avoided horror films entirely after that night, but the imagery from Campground Slaughter continued to haunt her dreams. Years later, when recounting the event, she said, "It wasn't just a movie. It was alive somehow, and it left something behind in all of us who saw it. Her testimony became one of the most detailed accounts of the screening, a grim reminder of the film's power to leave a lasting scar on those who encountered it. Alan Rickwalder's death was as strange and unsettling as the film he created. Weeks after the ill-fated screening of Campground Slaughter, neighbors began to notice a foul smell emanating from his two-story home. They assumed it was a plumbing issue or perhaps an abandoned pet, as Alan had rarely been seen outside. When the odor grew unbearable, they finally alerted the authorities. When police entered the house, they found a scene that defied explanation. The entire interior was in a state of utter disarray, as if Alan had abandoned all sense of order. Film reels and papers were scattered across every surface, many of them covered in what officers described as a black, tar-like substance. The walls were smeared with it too, and strange, incoherent phrases had been scrawled in thick, uneven strokes. The infamous I-like symbols were everywhere on the floors, ceilings, and even scratched into the furniture. The officers followed a trail of the black substance to the basement, where they found Alan's body. He was lying on the floor, surrounded by piles of film and equipment. The stench of decay was overwhelming, and his body was in an advanced state of decomposition, far more than could be explained by the time since he was last seen alive. Strangely, the coroner later determined that Alan, the legacy of Campground Slaughter, is steeped in mystery, controversy, and fear. After Alan Rickwalder's death, the film itself seemed to vanish. The single print used for its disastrous screening was confiscated during the police investigation and placed in the department's archives. However, when researchers and collectors later sought it out, they were told it had disappeared. No one could explain how a police-secured item could simply go missing. This absence only added to the film's legend. Stories began circulating among film enthusiasts about bootleg copies surfacing in obscure collections. Some claimed to have seen fragments of the movie, often describing the same haunting elements that plagued its screening: shadows moving unnaturally, unsettling whispers, and the infamous killer whose decayed form seemed surreal. These accounts, however, were impossible to verify, as no physical evidence of the film ever emerged. Collectors of rare horror films have offered astronomical sums for a genuine copy of Campground Slaughter. Despite their efforts, no one has publicly claimed to possess it. The lack of evidence has led skeptics to dismiss the film as an urban legend, a cautionary tale about the dangers of obsession and ambition in filmmaking. Yet, those who were involved with or witnessed the film continue to insist on its existence, recounting stories of its curse with chilling conviction. Adding to its infamy are the fates of the cast and crew. Over the years, nearly everyone who worked on the film or appeared on screen met untimely deaths. From accidents to unexplained illnesses, their demises only fueled the idea that the project was cursed. These tragic events have made Campground Slaughter more than just a lost film. It's become a dark myth, whispered about in the corners of horror fandom. To this day, Campground Slaughter remains a mystery. Whether it truly existed in the form people claim or has been exaggerated by fear and rumor, its story endures. For some, it's the ultimate piece of forbidden cinema, a glimpse into the darkest corners of filmmaking. For others, it's a warning, a tale of how the pursuit of horror can unleash something far more real than anyone ever intended. The curse of Campground Slaughter didn't end with its production or even with Alan Rickwalder's death. Over the years, nearly every cast member who appeared in the film suffered an untimely and often unexplained demise. While tragic accidents and unfortunate events are not uncommon, the sheer number of deaths tied to the film raised unsettling questions. To those familiar with the movie's dark history, it seemed as though the curse had followed its actors far beyond the set. Jessica Pickman, who played Maria's best friend in the film, was among the first to meet a tragic fate. Just 3 months after production ended, she was struck by a drunk driver while walking home from class. Witnesses reported hearing her mutter something strange as paramedics worked to save her life. "What is that woman doing here?" she reportedly asked, staring at an empty spot on the roadside. She died before anyone could understand what she meant. Other cast members met similarly eerie ends. One actor, who had played a minor role, was found dead in his apartment under mysterious circumstances. Neighbors claimed to have heard strange noises like muffled screams coming from his unit the night before. The cause of death was officially ruled as heart failure, but his friends insisted he had been in perfect health. The actress who portrayed Maria herself, the film's ill-fated protagonist, also did not escape the curse. While she survived the horrific on-set accident that claimed the life of the actor playing the killer, she later died during what should have been a routine surgery to repair injuries sustained during filming. Doctors reported complications they couldn't fully explain, and several hospital staff members recounted an overwhelming sense of unease while treating her. One nurse claimed she felt an icy hand touch her shoulder in the operating room just moments before the actress's heart stopped. Even crew members weren't spared. The janitor who had been fired after noticing Alan's strange notes was later found drowned in a local reservoir, though he was a strong swimmer. The coroner ruled it an accident, but his family insisted he had no reason to be near the water that night. Others who worked behind the scenes reported vivid nightmares and sudden health issues in the months following the film's completion. For those who knew of the deaths, the connection to Campground Slaughter was undeniable. Each incident seemed to echo the film's themes of inescapable dread, as though the horrors captured on screen had bled into the lives of those who had brought it to life. Whether it was mere coincidence or something far darker, one thing was certain: Campground Slaughter left a legacy of fear and loss that would haunt everyone involved until their dying days.